The iron gate groaned as Edward Harrington stepped into the gray morning, damp air threading through his suit like cold fingers. Magnolia leaves were slick with dew, and somewhere a sprinkler clicked, paused, clicked again, as if the garden itself were holding its breath. He took the stone steps slowly, feeling the old routine of grief reawaken. The way his eyes always drifted to the places Margaret loved. The white roses near the sundial, the bench under the elm, the small brass watering can she insisted wasn't too heavy. Then he saw it, a thin band of gold on the gardener's hand, worn to a dull glow, with a hairline scratch beside the stone. A scratch he knew the way a sailor knows the seam of a faithful sail. Samuel turned the soil with steady strokes, but each time his hand flexed, the ring caught the light, and the world Edward had cemented with money and order shifted a fraction out of place. He stopped at the edge of the bed of roses. The air smelled of wet earth and lavanda, the same lavender Margaret tucked in drawers to tame the scent of mothballs. "Where did you get that ring?" His voice sounded odd to him, too soft for the question. Samuel lifted his eyes. There was no flinch in them, no darting panic, only the careful regard of a man standing between a secret and a storm. "Sir," he said, and glanced down as if the ring might answer for him. Edward's gaze fell to a corner of paper peeking from Samuel's pocket. Creamstock, edges foxed by time, a familiar emboss in the corner. The law firm's crest, a lion with a key between its teeth. That crest had been pressed into the envelope the day the will was read, the day when lawyers spoke in gentle brackets around a silence that ate the room whole. "If you're still with me, hold onto the scratch on that ring. It comes back where it shouldn't." He took one step closer. Mud climbed the leather of his Oxfords like a stain deciding to become permanent. "Answer me." Samuel sank the spade and let it stand like a flag. "It isn't stolen." His thumb drifted to the band, rubbed that shallow scar along the gold as if polishing an old thought. The gesture was intimate, learned. It belonged to someone who'd watched Margaret do the same without meaning to. "Then how?" Edward asked. The wind moved through the elm and dropped a freckle of rain onto his cuff. Somewhere a gull cried from the river. He hated how the world kept functioning around the question. Samuel's jaw worked once, twice. He reached into his pocket and pulled the paper free. It was folded twice over, the crease sharp even after years, corners softened by being opened, then closed, then opened again by hands that couldn't quite let it go. He held it for a beat at his chest, then let it fall into Edward's open palm. The paper was heavier than it looked. Edward smelled old ink and the faint bite of the wax seal that must have been broken long ago. He unfolded it carefully. The emboss was the same, the watermark the firm used on official addenda. At the top, in a clerk's tidy typing, "Confidential addendum, to be revealed only upon contestation of the will." He read lower and saw handwriting. The slope of the letters caught his breath. Margaret's hand, neat and unhurried. The one that had labeled seed packets and birthday cards, and the note she'd left him in the hospital when she thought he'd sleep past visiting hours. The garden hushed. Even the sprinkler seemed to forget its rhythm. Edward looked up, throat tight. "Who told you to wear that?" Samuel's answer was a single exhale. "She did." The page trembled in Edward's fingers, and the first line of Margaret's own ink resolved into a name he never expected to see written by her there. Samuel Okoye. Edward's knees weakened, and he steadied himself on the cold iron edge of the sundial. The letters swam for a moment, but the ink was real, pressed deep enough into the paper fibers that he could feel its texture with his fingertip. Samuel Okoye, written by Margaret's hand, looped with the same flourish she used whenever she signed a check for the household staff. But this wasn't a payment. This was something else entirely. Samuel shifted his weight, boots sinking into the damp earth. "She told me not to say anything unless..." His voice cracked like a fence post under too much frost. "Unless it became unbearable for you." The words stung like betrayal wrapped in mercy. Edward thought of the day Margaret collapsed in the conservatory, her ring cutting into her swollen finger as he held her hand. He had insisted on burying her with it, a final, untouchable token. And yet here it was, pulsing on Samuel's hand like a secret heartbeat. The page trembled again as Edward read further. "This addendum is to be shared if Edward struggles with grief, or if the fairness of my will is challenged. It holds the truth about the ring, about Samuel, and about the bond I could not put into spoken words. If you're still with me, breathe carefully, because what hides between these lines was never meant to be read in daylight." Edward's chest tightened. "What bond?" he demanded, though he dreaded the answer more than silence. Samuel stepped closer, and the smell of cut grass clung to him, sharp and earthy. His voice lowered, steady now. almost tender. Not what you think. She trusted me. She trusted me with something she didn't trust anyone else to carry. Edward's fingers clenched around the paper. His eyes darted back to the next sentence, but the ink blurred through the sting of tears he had sworn never to show again. Before he could force the words into focus, a sudden gust tore the page halfway from his grip. And for an instant, it looked ready to vanish into the garden's hungry air. Edward lunged, catching the page before the wind could steal it. The paper crinkled in his grasp, damp at the corners where the dew had kissed it. His breath came heavy, louder than the rustling trees. He smoothed the fold and forced his eyes back to the script, unwilling to let another word escape him. The ring was never buried, Margaret had written. I asked Samuel to keep it safe, as he once kept me safe when I could not speak my fears aloud. If you ever see this, Edward, know that I chose him for a reason. The sentence fractured the air around him. Chose him. The phrase felt like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward, distorting everything he thought he knew about her last days. His mind reeled back to the weeks before her passing. The way Margaret sometimes sat on the porch long after the lamps were lit, Samuel's shadow visible in the distance as he worked late among the hedges. Edward had never questioned it. Why would he? His world was built on certainty, on contracts and signatures and the illusion that money made people transparent. Why didn't you tell me? He whispered, though his voice barely belonged to him anymore. Samuel's face was unreadable, carved in the dim light like one of the stone statues lining the garden, because it was hers to tell. Not mine. If you're still with me, don't blink. The weight of her choice is about to land where it never should have. Edward felt his heart pound against the paper. A dozen memories clawed at him. Margaret's last smile, her trembling hand on his cheek, the lawyer's dry voice reading lines that suddenly seemed too neat, too polished. And now here was this gardener, holding a truth with the same ease he held a shovel. The page fluttered in Edward's grip, and as his eyes sank lower, another line surfaced, written in darker ink, as though she had pressed harder into the page. If Edward cannot bear the silence, give him the letter hidden in the cedar box. He froze. There was no cedar box in her belongings. At least, none he had ever seen. Edward's pulse thudded in his ears. A cedar box? He had cataloged every item after Margaret's death, turned over drawers, unlocked safes, even kept her scarves folded with obsessive precision. There had been no cedar box. Unless... His eyes lifted to the gardener. Samuel's hands were steady now, the ring catching a thin vein of sunlight as he adjusted his grip on the shovel. Where is it? Edward asked, the words sharp, almost breaking. Samuel's gaze flicked to the old elm tree at the far edge of the garden. Its roots curled above the soil like knuckles, gnarled and stubborn. Edward followed the line of that glance, his stomach tightening. She trusted me to keep it where no storm could touch it, Samuel said quietly. Edward's throat burned. You buried it here. The gardener didn't confirm, didn't deny. Instead, he pressed the spade into the earth with a slow, deliberate push, the sound of metal against soil ringing like a verdict. Stay with me for this breath, because what rises from the ground will not go back the same way. Edward stumbled toward the elm, shoes sinking into the softened earth. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the cold mud seeping through expensive wool. Samuel crouched opposite him, their hands inches apart on the soil. For the first time, Edward noticed the calluses on the man's palms, the roughness of someone who worked with patience, not haste. Then Samuel dug, not hurried, not secretive, as if this moment had been rehearsed 100 times in silence. The spade caught against something solid, wood resisting the blade with a hollow thud. Edward's breath hitched. Together they cleared the dirt until a small cedar box emerged, darkened by years underground, its brass hinges flecked with green. Samuel lifted it carefully, mud streaking his arms, and set it between them. Edward reached forward, his fingers trembling as they traced the carved initials on the lid. Not hers alone, but both of theirs. An E entwined with an M. The lid creaked open, and inside lay a sealed envelope with his name written across it in Margaret's unmistakable hand. Edward's hands shook as he lifted the envelope from the cedar box. The paper was brittle at the edges, but her handwriting was still bold. The ink pressed deep as though Margaret had wanted every letter of his name to endure. He pressed it against his chest for a moment, feeling the faint tremor of his heartbeat through the fragile paper. The gardener lowered his gaze, as though he were trespassing on something sacred. The smell of damp cedar drifted between them, mingling with the sharp scent of freshly turned earth. Edward slid a finger under the seal and tore it open, the sound louder than the morning birds. Her words bled across the page. Edward, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and Samuel has done as I asked. I never wished to wound you, only to leave behind the whole of my truth. The ring was my promise to you, but it was also my trust in him. When I was ill, when fear hollowed me, Samuel carried burdens I never told you about, so you could remember me without shadows. I made him my guardian of silence. Do not see betrayal in this, but gratitude. Edward's breath faltered. Gratitude. The word clawed at him, refusing to soften. The letter went on. You built me a world of safety, but he gave me a space to breathe when I felt trapped by pity. Both loves mattered, both were real, and if the will is questioned, this truth may wound, but it is my way of protecting the man I loved, and the man who helped me endure. If you're still here, hold this moment, because the next line tears open what you thought was whole. Edward's eyes blurred as he read the final passage. What I leave behind is not divided, but doubled. The fortune is not only yours, Edward. It must be shared with Samuel. That was always my hidden page. His grip slackened. The letter drifted toward the soil, caught only at the last second by Samuel's hand. Their eyes met across the box, and for the first time, Edward didn't see a servant. He saw a man carrying half of Margaret's truth. And with that realization came a question more unbearable than the words on the page. Had his wife's greatest secret been love or mercy? Edward staggered back from the cedar box, his polished shoes sliding in the mud. The world tilted, the roses blurred, the elm bent low as if eavesdropping. He pressed a palm to his temple, trying to steady the pounding in his skull. Samuel still knelt, the letter folded once more in his hands. He wasn't gloating, wasn't triumphant. His face was lined with the same grief Edward had carried for 3 years. That grief looked different in calloused hands, but it was grief all the same. Why didn't she tell me? Edward whispered, the words raw, cracked. She did, Samuel answered gently. Not with words you wanted, but with what she left behind. The sentence burned. Edward had always believed love was proved by loyalty, by appearances kept pristine. Now the earth itself seemed to conspire against him, unearthing a bond he hadn't known he was sharing. He reached blindly for the sundial, his fingers slick with mud, and for a moment he feared he might collapse. Don't look away now. The silence in this garden holds more than either man is ready to admit. Edward turned, his breath ragged. She wanted me to give half of it away. To you. Samuel didn't flinch. Not money. She wanted you to see me. The words fell heavier than any fortune. The gardener extended the folded page back to him, but Edward couldn't lift his hand. His chest ached with an unfamiliar weight. Not just betrayal, not just sorrow, but the terrifying suspicion that Margaret's final act had been less about wealth and more about forcing him to face the one truth he'd spent a lifetime ignoring. That love could not be owned, even by a man who owned everything else. And as the paper hovered between them, Edward realized he would have to choose whether to accept it or let the will itself split him in two. Edward closed his eyes, and for a fleeting instant he imagined Margaret's laughter, light and unburdened, echoing across the garden. But when he opened them again, all that remained was the gardener's steady gaze and the fragile paper trembling between them. His fingers finally reached forward, brushing against Samuel's calloused skin as he took the letter back. The contact jolted him more than the words had. He looked down at the neat folds, the ink that carried her voice past the grave. She had woven them together without his consent. His name and Samuel's, tied on the same page, in the same sentence, as if she had known they would one day kneel in the dirt side by side. Edward's throat tightened. How long? He asked. Have you been waiting to hand me this? Since the day we put her to rest, Samuel replied. His voice didn't shake. It was calm, grounded, as though he had rehearsed those words 1,000 times in silence. The garden grew unbearably still. Not even a bird stirred in the elm. Edward's chest rose and fell with sharp breaths, each one rattling against the walls of his composure. If you're still here, remember this pause. It's the kind that cracks open just before the truth steps through. He stared at Samuel, at the ring glinting faintly on his hand. Rage and grief twisted together inside him, but beneath them was something far stranger. Recognition. Margaret had trusted this man, perhaps not with her heart as a lover, but with her fears, her unfinished words, her secrets too fragile for the man she had married. Edward realized with a shiver that went bone deep that the hidden page of her will wasn't about dividing wealth. It was about uniting two halves of her life that he had never thought could touch. and as he folded the paper shut, his reflection wavered in the gold of the ring. Not as a husband wronged, but as a man confronted by the one truth money could never erase. Edward rose slowly, knees aching from the damp soil, the letter clutched so tightly it crumpled in his palm. The cedar box lay open at his feet, its scent of old wood and earth heavy in the air. He looked at Samuel again. Really looked. Past the dirt under his nails, past the rough clothes. He saw the steadiness, the quiet strength Margaret must have leaned on when she was fading. "You think I can just accept this?" Edward's voice cracked, harsher than he intended. "That she gave you a part of everything that was mine?" Samuel's eyes didn't waver. "It was never about taking from you. It was about leaving you something whole. She knew your grief would eat you alive if she didn't give it a way out." Edward's chest tightened. For the first time, he wasn't sure whether his anger was aimed at Samuel, at Margaret, or at himself. He thought of the long nights after her death, wandering the mansion's halls, clutching a glass of scotch that never dulled the silence. She had seen that future coming, had tried to build a bridge for him in the shape of another man's loyalty. "Stay with me now, because the choice waiting here will mark him more deeply than the will itself." Edward turned the ring in Samuel's hand with his gaze, the tiny scratch catching the last trace of morning light. He could snatch it back, bury it, pretend the hidden page never existed, or he could face the unbearable truth that Margaret's last act had been to bind their lives together, not for wealth, but for remembrance. His lips parted, but no words came. The wind carried only the faintest whisper of lavender through the garden, her perfume, her ghost, her demand. Finally, Edward spoke, his voice low and jagged. "If I take this step, if I accept what she wrote, nothing in my life will ever look the same again." Samuel nodded once, the gesture solemn. That's exactly what she wanted. And with those words, the letter in Edward's hand felt less like paper and more like a door, one he feared to open, but one he knew he could no longer leave shut. Edward stood there, the letter heavy in his grip, while the garden pressed in with its silence. The sundial's shadow had shifted. Time was moving, even if his world wasn't. He thought of Margaret's handwriting, the way she always curved her E into a loop at the end. That same loop had tied his name to Samuel's, and no matter how he tried, he couldn't untangle it. He drew a shaky breath. "She wanted us both to carry her memory," he said at last, though the words tasted like iron. "Not alone, not apart." Samuel bowed his head, not in victory but in respect. The ring on his hand caught the light again, and Edward saw not theft, not betrayal, but the echo of a trust Margaret had chosen. "If you've stayed with me this far, hold this image, because sometimes love writes its truth in hands we least expect." Edward looked back down at the cedar box, then at the gardener who had become the unwilling keeper of his wife's last secret. For the first time, he felt the anger loosen its grip, replaced by something he hadn't allowed in years: surrender. He closed the letter gently, pressing the fold flat, and slipped it back into the box. His eyes lingered on Samuel. "We'll read the rest together," he said quietly. Every word she left behind. The wind swept through the garden, scattering petals across the soil like confetti from a wedding long past. Edward watched them fall, and in that fragile rain of white, he felt Margaret's presence, not choosing between them, but binding them. He turned toward the house, but before he took the first step, he looked back once more. "When people hear this story, they'll think it's about inheritance," he murmured. "But it isn't. It's about what she saw in us that we never saw in each other." Samuel met his eyes. "And what's left for us now is to prove she wasn't wrong." Edward nodded, and the word formed silently in his chest, a code he would never speak aloud but would carry forever. Frame.